Hello, welcome to my recap of round 2 game between Nepomniachtchi and Fabiano Caruana. They both were on 1 point after 1 round, and they were the only leaders in the candidates, and now they faced off each other. I guess that's how you say it, I don't know. And let's check it out. Let's see what happened. We have the Italian opening after bishop c4, knight f6, and now Jan plays d3. Doesn't want to go for knight g5, fried liver, and he just goes for, I think I would say gioco piano. I'm not sure about the names. Fabi goes for bishop c5, and now he goes for a castle. Here in this opening there are lots of transpositions and lots of move orders that are quite subtle and in my opinion very confusing, so I think I would skip that part because I would need a separate video to explain all the intricacies and details about the move orders and which one goes where, which one suits black, which one suits white, so I'm gonna skip that part. Black goes d6 and now c3. The point of this c3 is to keep the bishop pair alive, because once the d6 pawn defends e5, knight a5 is a strong threat. So white is trying to evacuate his bishop via b3 to c2, and that way to preserve his bishop pair, or just to go with a4 on the next move and try to expand even further with b4, a5. And here Fabi plays a6, also trying to make a shelter for his bishop, which might be very unpleasant for white's king side, hitting on f2 constantly. And now Nepomniachtchi plays a4, like I said, expanding on the queen side and also maybe stopping b5. And also, yes, after a6, and now knight a5 is a real threat, because the bishop doesn't have b5 square to escape to, and white would have to give up the bishop pair. Also, I think here bishop b3 is a quite natural move, and in case of knight a5, bishop c2. Just to show this real quick. In case of this, just bishop c2 or something like bishop f7 and b4. I don't know if it works, but it looks cool. But Nepomniachtchi tries to preserve the bishop pair other way with a move which is usually played, so it doesn't hurt white at all. And now bishop a7. Now black plays preemptively this bishop move because he wants to avoid getting pushed with d4 with tempo, which in some positions would be advantageous to white. And anyways, I think this bishop would go to a7, so why not move it straight away? And now white is fighting for a pawn push in the center, but now it's really tough to do that because there is a potential pin on g4 in case you push d4 too early. And that move is, I would say, quite harmless for black. So usually what white does and did in this game is that he prepares this slowly, and at some moment he's going to push d4, but not quite now. Fabi plays h6 here, trying to stop any pinning with bishop g5. And now knight bd2. This is a typical maneuver in the Italian. Knight d2, knight f1. The knight goes to g3 usually and tries to hit f5 or h5. And here, a very interesting idea in the Italian in general. Fabi plays g5. So he doesn't castle. He pushes on the king side and tries to maybe generate some play even on the king side. But mostly to gain some space and to maybe avoid some positional pressure on the king side. And to always keep white on his toes. To not be sure what to expect. Because at some moment it might come to g4 and black just might get some strong attack on the king side. And white plays b4, he tries to expand. Currently, a move like b5 is not an option because the rook on a1 hangs. So let's say, just to prove a point, if black castles and white plays b5, black can simply take it, and after ab there is bishop f2. A discovered check, and I think this is bad for white, because even though he gets some material, it's actually 2 pawns and the rook for 2 pieces, and also with the king being a bit vulnerable at the moment, I think it's a good situation for black. But never mind, this was never gonna happen. And Fabiano plays here knight g4, which I think is a novelty in this position. I think a move like knight h7 was being played on the regular basis on top level, and I think with the idea of queen f6 and just trying to push this g4 pawn, this g pawn actually, to g4. But Fabiano played a new idea, knight g4, and after rook e2, this was the point, queen f6. Trying to employ his queen and to move it to the king side. Now the threat is very simple. Knight captures f2 and you follow it up with g4. So let's say if I go some random move like a5, then black takes on f2, takes twice, and then g4. And in the end, black would emerge with an exchange up. So that's why here white has to over-defend the f2 pawn, so he plays queen e1. So now in case of knight f2 and taking twice on f2, on g4 the knight can move, because in the previous case the king was on f2, so rules of chess just don't allow such moves like knight h4. But in this case it's possible. So queen e1 by Nepo, and now queen g7. And now actually h3 was a strong threat, because the knight doesn't have a square, so with queen g7, black keeps his queen on the king side where it's needed, and also vacates the f6 square for the knight. And in this position, also what I forgot to mention before, in the Italian or in any opening, a move like g5 is much more effective when the pawn is already on h3. So that's why white should refrain in general to play h3 at such positions when the king is not castled yet, because if you imagine that the pawn is on h3, let's say here, just for the sake of the argument, now black can play g4 and open up the g-file, let's say even knight g4, and this attack on the g-file might be very, very unpleasant for white, because black has a very easy game. Rook g8, queen f6, queen g6, and he might put some pressure on g2. And if you combine it with the bishop on a7, which pins the king, it can be quite problematic for white. So that's why white refrains from playing h3, and let's go back to this position now. After queen g7, And now if white plays h3, now of course you don't take on f2, you just go back. And white cannot stop g4. And we will see just the same unpleasant game. Let's say a5, g4 takes, knight takes, or bishop takes, whatever. And you follow it up with rook g8, or even just here queen g4 and rook g8. And I don't really like white's prospects in this position. So, understandably, because of that, Nepo doesn't do any pawn moves on the king side, and he just continues his development and his maneuvering, which is very typical for the Italian, like I said before. Knight f1, and he heads for g3, and finally he might get to f5 or h5, which is quite weakened by the move g5. Now Fabi castles, and knight g3, knight e7. Also very typical maneuver for the Italian, because the knight on c6 is quite bad because of the pawn on c3. The pawn on c3 just restricts the movement of this knight, so the knight has to find some other way to be productive. And once the knight moved from c6, Nepo chose this moment to push d4. And at the first glance, it seems like it's a pawn blunder, because white defends this pawn only twice, but black attacks this pawn thrice. But actually it's very risky to take this pawn, because after taking twice, of course you don't take on d4, because after queen takes, the bishop and the rook are attacked, and white cannot defend both. So that would be just lost. So here white would just play rook a3, and the bishop would have to go away from this diagonal. Because if it goes to f6, I think there's just knight h5, and you capture the bishop, put the bishop to b2, and there is lots of pressure on the king side. Plus, with this rook a3 move, like it happened in the game eventually, you always hint for some kingside action with rook g3 at some moment. Not immediately, of course, because there is some disturbance, but at some point for sure. So after cd, black goes for knight c6 back. Because now these pawns are quite soft, and they can be used by this knight. But anyways, here Nepo ignores this, and he goes rook a3. A very clever idea, just trying to include his rook in potential attack on the king side. And now Fabi takes on d4, so we have a sacrifice of the pawn. And now he tries to kick this knight away, which is quite annoying. At the moment, knight goes to e5, and now bishop a2. Bishop stays on this diagonal because it has to, it doesn't have a better square, and it keeps some pressure on the a2 g8 diagonal. And now Fabi strikes with c5, trying to maybe make a passer on the queen side to somehow counter this potential initiative on the king side. Nepo takes on c5, bishop c5. And maybe here he was afraid of dc and bishop d5, just putting some slight pressure on the b7. And I think with bishop c5 he was more at ease, because with bishop c5 at least he's getting some tempi on the rook. And now Nepo goes rook b3, which is looking a bit weird, because it blocks the bishop, but also it restrains this bishop on c8 because you attack on b7 and the bishop cannot move so easily. But here I want to show you one interesting line. After bishop c5, there was an option to just give up the exchange on a3, and the move was bishop d5 with the similar purpose to keep this bishop on c8 by putting pressure on b7, and in case of black taking the bait, bishop takes. Now d6 pawn hangs. If you do something like queen f6, I think you can do knight h5, and when the rook comes to e3 and g3, I think black's king is a bit soft here. I'm not sure entirely, but it feels a bit unpleasant. Because once the rook comes to g3, f4 comes to mind, and when you open up the position, it looks a little bit scary for black. So after bishop a3, if black chooses to not do this, but bishop e6, why would that be the move? Oh no, sorry. In this position, bishop e6, instead of queen f6, if let's say bishop e6, then d6 pawn hangs, and after this just take on b7, and after rook a7, knight h5, probably queen g6, and after you capture queen h5 and rook d2, I think that white has good chances here to at least survive because of these very bad squares on the king side. The king is a bit shaky in this case. And of course here you cannot take the bishop because after takes and take the bishop, there is a checkmate on the other side after this. So, where was I? After bishop d5, black can also ignore this and just go for rook b8, trying to go for b5, but I think that after king h2 or... no, not king h2, rook b3, let's say, and if b5, just king h2 then. And this would be quite sharp as well, because white has f4 at disposal, and once he opens up the position, it's gonna be really double-edged. But anyways, here after bishop c5, Nepo chose to go rook b3 and to attack b7, and now Fabi has a nice tactic. He plays b5 because you cannot take twice like this, since black has bishop a6 and he strikes at both rooks. So Nepo chose to release the g3 square for the rook and to go with knight f5. Because I think that knight h5 would not bring the same effect, because after queen g6, the knight has to go back, or you have to play g4, which is quite absurd. So he chose this. And now Fabi chose to not give up the bishop pair. He just chose to play queen f6. But this doesn't change Nepo's plan, because even in case of bishop f5, ef, the next plan is just rook g3, king h2, f4, and opening up on the king side. So after queen f6, king h2 first to step aside from the pin, and after ba4, which takes the second pawn, rook g3, and things are not quite pleasant for black, because now there are some ideas like knight h6, followed by bishop g5, and opening up black's king. Let's say if you just ignore this by bishop b7, for example, then knight h6, queen takes, bishop g5 looks good. Or even this, rook takes g5, looks very, very tempting. I think that's even better because on knight g6 you have rook c5, and this looks dead lost, in my opinion. So to avoid this, he goes king h7 just to move from this potential pin, from this pin. And now this is not so effective because you can just take it, and after bishop g5, just queen h5, and in case of bishop f6, just to cover yourself up, knight g6, and I don't see how can white proceed. So now Nepo played queen d1, hitting on a4, at least to decrease damage, if nothing else. Now Fabiano defends this pawn by bishop d7, and now rook c2. The point of this move is to free the diagonal for the queen to get to h5 and to strike with bishop g5 next. Actually, bishop g5 was a threat on the next move. Let's say if you play a3, bishop g5, let's take with the pawn, and then just queen h5, king g8, and rook takes g5. And now the bishop on a2 is MVP, because if you go knight g6, then I take on g6, take, and because of this pin, you cannot capture my queen. So that's a GG in this position. So to stop all this, black chose to just eliminate the knight on f5, and after ef, queen takes f5 looks way too risky because it allows bishop g5. And of course here hg is impossible because of queen h5 and rook takes g5, which is lost quite surely. So Fabiano plays rook a b8, and now Nepo makes one more threat. Queen h5 is played, and now bishop g5 is a strong threat, using the pin on the king. Now to defend this, black goes rook g8, stopping bishop g5, and now bishop b2. And now the f7 pawn is a bit weak, so black somehow has to defend this pawn. But how to do that? If you try rook b7, let's say, you can take on e5, and d5 is impossible because of bishop. So if queen takes, again, bishop f7 exists, and bishop g6 comes next, and this might be quite painful for black. So I think that Caruana just chose the right move, and he just went for rook g8. And now Nepo goes back to c1, hitting again on g5. Fabiano goes back to g8, and now we have bishop b2. And here they repeat moves, and that's how the game finishes. After bishop c1, rook g8, and that's the end. That's a draw, and they both have 1.5 points after 2 games. I just want to show you before I wrap this up. After bishop b2, there was somewhat risky line for black, I think, to give up the exchange by rook b2. And if white takes, to go a3, and this way the game would continue, but it would be quite double-edged, I would say, because also white can attack like rook b7, bishop f2, rook a3, and I don't know, maybe d5 and defend a6, and also block the bishop, because the point is, after bishop d5, which is a huge mistake, black has queen d6 and all sorts of threats, capturing the bishop, capturing the rook, knight f3, double check with queen h2 next. So after d5, I think this would be quite entertaining, but of course, I think they were in time trouble, so it would not be a smart decision to make, especially this early in the tournament when it's not the right time. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching this, and stay tuned for more videos.